Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. You have certainly heard the name Cleopatra, but what do you really know about her? This is not merely the story of an Egyptian queen. It is a drama about power, love, betrayal, and the struggle for independence. In this video, you will learn how Cleopatra, still very young, was drawn into a deadly battle for the throne, and how she managed to form an alliance with none other than Julius Caesar himself. We will tell you how her personal relationships with the two most powerful men of Rome, Caesar and Mark Antony, turned into weapons of politics. You will learn why Rome feared Cleopatra, how her alliance with Antony became a threat to the entire Mediterranean, and how this fatal game ended. And of course, we will look at the most famous scene of her life. Was it true that Cleopatra died from a snake's bite? Or was everything entirely different? Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. The story of Cleopatra begins long before her name became a symbol of power, diplomatic genius, and tragic destiny. She was born into a world that had been ruled for almost 3 centuries by the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's closest companions, Ptolemy who, after the death of the great conqueror, received Egypt as his share and founded his own royal line there. The Ptolemies were of Hellenistic origin but ruled Egypt by adapting many local traditions. They preserved Egyptian rites, assumed the titles of pharaohs, built temples for the gods of the Nile Valley, and took part in religious ceremonies. Yet at court, they lived according to Greek customs, spoke Greek, and patronized science, philosophy, literature, and art. Their capital, Alexandria, became the greatest intellectual and cultural center of the Mediterranean, a city that housed the legendary Library of Alexandria and one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Pharos Lighthouse. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in the 69th year before Christ. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Neos Dionysus, nicknamed Olites, which in Greek means the flute player. The name reflected either his love of music or, according to his critics, his tendency to neglect affairs of state for pleasure. In truth, he was a ruler caught between the grinding stones of great international interests. The name of Cleopatra's mother has not been preserved in the sources. Most likely she came from the family of concubines or priestesses, perhaps of Egyptian origin, although there is no definite confirmation. In any case, Cleopatra grew up in a world where Greek and Egyptian traditions were deeply intertwined, and this made her a unique figure among the rulers of her dynasty. Ptolemy XII had 6 children, 2 elder daughters, Berenice IV and Cleopatra VI Tryphena, a younger sister, Arsinoe IV, and 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Each of them would, at one time or another, become either her ally or her rival, and some her open enemies threatening her life. Cleopatra's childhood passed within the Palace of Alexandria, an immense and luxurious complex near the royal harbor. From its windows, one could see the Pharos Lighthouse, whose fires lit the bay, and endless rows of masts carrying ships from every corner of the Mediterranean and the East. Inside, marble halls, colonnades, fountains, and inner gardens filled the air with the scent of orange and pomegranate trees. But behind this splendor lay a constant whirl of court intrigues, conspiracies, and dangers. From an early age, Cleopatra received a brilliant Hellenistic education. Court tutors taught her grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and diplomacy. Special attention was given to languages. She spoke Greek perfectly, fluently mastered Egyptian, a rarity among her dynasty, and knew Latin, Aramaic, Syrian, Ethiopian, and, according to some sources, several other Eastern tongues. Her study of Egyptian was not a mere formality. It was a conscious political decision. Cleopatra understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she must speak to her subjects in their own language, address priests, merchants, and officials directly, not through translators as her predecessors had done. Sources emphasize that Cleopatra stood out not for her beauty, but for her intellect, quick wit, and ability to charm people. Her voice was described as soft, melodic, and captivating. She learned early to listen, to analyze, and to grasp the essence of things swiftly. Even in youth, she was often invited to attend discussions with advisors, priests, and foreign envoys. The political climate of her childhood was unstable. Her father, Ptolemy XII, found himself in a difficult position. Egypt formally remained independent, but in reality had long been dependent on the Roman Republic, which interfered in its affairs and dictated conditions. To keep his throne, Ptolemy had to pay Rome vast sums, mortgage Egyptian lands, and borrow heavily from Roman bankers, especially from the family of Crassus. The people despised him for his concessions to Rome and for the crushing taxes that burdened ordinary Egyptians. Riots broke out in Alexandria and soon turned into open rebellion. While Ptolemy fled hastily to Rome to ask for help, his eldest daughter, Berenice IV, seized power, was crowned queen, and formally became Egypt's ruler, strengthening her position by marriage. Cleopatra, still very young, understood what such a struggle within the royal family could lead to. The years of her father's exile became a vital lesson. She watched as he spent a fortune in Rome, bribing senators, making promises to patrons, and hiring mercenaries to regain his crown. In the 55th year before Christ, with the support of Roman troops under the Syrian proconsul Aulus Gabinius, Ptolemy XII returned to Egypt. The rebellion was crushed brutally. Berenice IV, though his own daughter, was executed, and her followers faced mass reprisals. After this return, Cleopatra became even closer to her father. She took an active part in court affairs, accompanied him during ceremonies, attended meetings with priests and officials, observed taxation systems, provincial governance, finances, and the army. The king increasingly trusted her with assignments. By that time, Cleopatra clearly understood that Egypt had become a pawn in Rome's hands. The country's position teetered between formal independence and actual submission to the mighty republic. She saw how some pharaohs became puppets of the Senate while others resisted, and paid with their lives. The death of Ptolemy XII in the 51st year before Christ opened a new chapter, a struggle for the throne between Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. In his will, their father formally appointed them co-rulers, but real power would now depend not on documents but on the ability to survive, to bargain, to outwit, or to triumph. The death of Ptolemy XII in the 51st year before Christ marked the end of an era, one of fragile balance between Rome, domestic opposition, and dynastic intrigue. With his passing, Egypt plunged into crisis, where the state's fate depended on who could seize and hold the throne amid endless power struggles. According to his will, the crown passed jointly to his daughter Cleopatra and his younger son Ptolemy XIII. At the time of her father's death, Cleopatra was about 18 years old, and her brother only 10. Such sibling co-rule was common among the Ptolemies, where brother-sister marriages served to strengthen legitimacy and continuity. The will, sealed and signed by Roman consuls, had not only local force, but international recognition, since Egypt's fate had long been intertwined with Rome's interests. The new order was quickly formalized. Coins showed the young Ptolemy XIII wearing the pharaoh's crown, while Cleopatra's name appeared beside his, denoting equality. Official documents began with the formula, King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra, the brother and sister gods. But beneath this facade of unity, division was growing. A group of regents soon formed around the boy king, controlling Egypt in his name. The chief among them was Pothinus, his eunuch tutor, ambitious and cruel. Alongside him stood Achilles, commander of the army, and Theodotus of Chios, a rhetorician of great talent but little conscience. They quickly realized Cleopatra was no docile figurehead. She intended to rule. Within the first year of her reign, decrees began appearing under her name alone, omitting Ptolemy's. Coins were minted bearing only her image, a rarity in a dynasty that emphasized male power. Cleopatra took control of foreign and domestic policy, managed finances and taxes, courted the priesthood's support, especially in Upper Egypt where respect for pharaohs remained strong, and spoke publicly in both Greek and Egyptian, a move that irritated the Greek elite but won her the people. Her independence enraged Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus. They knew that unless they crushed her influence quickly, she would soon dominate entirely. A campaign of slander began. Courtiers whispered that Cleopatra disdained Hellenic traditions, sided with Egyptians, ignored the aristocracy, and behaved like an autocrat. Meanwhile, the economy suffered. Debts to Roman bankers remained, harvests were poor, grain prices soared, and unrest grew. Cleopatra tried to stabilize the situation, lowering taxes in Upper Egypt, negotiating with temples and guilds. But time worked against her. By the beginning of the 50th year before Christ, the conflict erupted openly. Cleopatra was excluded from ceremonies. Her signature vanished from state papers. Soon she was ordered to leave Alexandria, formally for rest, in truth, exile. She went to the Thebaid in southern Egypt, where loyalty to the pharaohs ran deep. There she began gathering troops, winning the support of governors, priests, and mercenaries from Nubia and the Near East. At the same time, her younger sister Arsinoe IV began maneuvering for power, waiting for the right moment to act. In Alexandria, Pothinus and his allies consolidated control under Ptolemy XIII. They realized that to destroy Cleopatra completely, they needed Roman backing. But Egypt was about to be drawn into an even larger conflict: Rome's civil war. In the 49th year before Christ, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and marched against Pompey the Great. The war intensified, and soon its outcome would decide not only Rome's fate, but also Egypt's. After his defeat at Pharsalus in the 48th year before Christ, Pompey fled to Egypt hoping for refuge. But Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus, knowing Caesar had triumphed, plotted to win favor with Rome. They set a trap. The moment Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death. His severed head and signet ring were sent to Caesar as a gift. This act would soon prove a fatal mistake. Caesar, arriving in Alexandria only days later, was horrified. To him, the murder of a Roman citizen and consul without trial and on foreign soil was not a service, but a crime. And from that moment began the chain of events that would change not only the struggle for Egypt's throne, but Cleopatra's entire life. When in October of the 48th year before Christ Julius Caesar landed in Egypt, his arrival marked not just another episode of Rome's civil war, but a turning point for the entire eastern Mediterranean. Officially, he came pursuing Pompey the Great, who, after his defeat at Pharsalus, had fled to Egypt seeking safety. But instead of hospitality, Pompey met treachery. By the order of Ptolemy's advisors, he was murdered the instant he stepped ashore, and his head was presented to Caesar as a sign of loyalty. Far from pleased, Caesar was outraged. Despite years of rivalry, Pompey was still a Roman citizen and former consul, a man with whom Caesar had shared alliances and enmities alike. The Egyptian's act struck him as insolence and meddling in Rome's affairs. He ordered Pompey a proper burial, summoned both sides of the Egyptian dispute, and declared that he, acting on behalf of Rome, would enforce the will of the late Ptolemy XII, a document the Senate had recognized as legally binding. That will stipulated that Egypt's throne belonged jointly to Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Thus Caesar, representing Rome, saw it as his duty to restore their co-rule and end the chaos. But his proclamation enraged Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus. They knew that Cleopatra's return meant their ruin. At that time, Cleopatra was outside Alexandria, near the Syrian border, raising troops to reclaim power. But hearing of Caesar's arrival, she made a bold decision. She would enter the city in secret and secure a personal audience with him, at any cost. Reaching Alexandria was perilous. The city was controlled by her enemies, and discovery meant death. So Cleopatra devised a daring plan that would become legend. She sailed secretly to the harbor by night in a small boat and had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters rolled inside a carpet, or, according to other accounts, in a linen sack. Her loyal servant Apollodorus of Sicily carried her through the guards. When Caesar's attendants unrolled the fabric and Cleopatra appeared before him, the effect was electrifying. A young woman of striking confidence and intelligence, speaking flawless Greek, addressed him not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She calmly recounted her father's will, her unlawful exile, and the treachery of Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus. Her tone was neither pleading nor emotional. It was logical, firm, and persuasive. Caesar, seasoned by decades of politics and war, immediately recognized her intellect and charisma. But beyond admiration, he saw in her a strategic ally. Through Cleopatra, Rome could secure Egypt's wealth and, above all, its vital grain supply. The next morning, Caesar summoned Ptolemy XIII for talks. When the boy king, about 13 years old, entered the chamber and saw Cleopatra standing beside Caesar, his reaction was furious. According to Plutarch, he tore the diadem from his head, flung it to the ground, and burst into tears, for he understood that his power was lost. Negotiations quickly broke down. Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus declared that Caesar had no right to interfere in Egypt's affairs. Caesar replied that he was merely enforcing the lawful will of Ptolemy XII, acknowledged by the Senate. The response was rebellion. Achillas rallied Ptolemy's army and laid siege to the royal quarter where Caesar and Cleopatra had taken refuge. Pothinus cut off food supplies to the harbor, trying to starve them out. Thus began the Alexandrian War. Caesar, with barely 4,000 soldiers, fortified the palace and harbor district, knowing his only hope lay in controlling the sea. He ordered the destruction of the Egyptian fleet anchored in port to prevent a blockade. The fire spread to nearby buildings and, as many believe, part of the Library of Alexandria's archives perished in those flames, though the exact extent remains uncertain. Street fighting raged. Ptolemy's forces outnumbered the Romans, but Caesar's troops had discipline and command. Cleopatra, meanwhile, worked tirelessly with local elites, promising peace, protection of temples, and the restoration of order. The turning point came when reinforcements arrived, auxiliary forces from Cilicia and Syria. At the same time, a revolt broke out in the city against Pothinus, accused of plotting against Caesar. He was arrested and executed. Achillas died in battle. Theodotus fled into exile. Ptolemy XIII, realizing defeat was inevitable, tried to escape through the Nile Delta, but his boat capsized in the marshes, and he drowned. His body was later recovered and brought back to the city. With resistance broken, Caesar reinstated Cleopatra on the throne. To maintain dynastic formality, he required her to marry her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, then about 12 years old. A purely nominal arrangement, as all true power now belonged to Cleopatra. Thus ended one of the most perilous and dramatic chapters of her life. Yet ahead lay a new stage, an alliance with mighty Rome itself, with Caesar, which would soon bring her not only power and stability, but also a son whose fate would forever bind Egypt to the destiny of the Roman world. When the smoke of war had cleared and the body of Ptolemy XIII was carried from the waters of the Nile, power in Egypt finally passed to Cleopatra. Formerly, she ruled together with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who at that time was only about 12 years old. Yet this partnership was purely nominal and had no real significance for governing the country. All authority now belonged to her, a woman who had not only survived a deadly dynastic war, but turned its outcome into the strengthening of her legitimacy. After the end of the Alexandrian War, Caesar remained in Egypt longer than both Rome and the Egyptian court had expected. Officially, he explained his presence by the need to restore order and settle administrative matters, but it was evident that there was another reason as well. His alliance with Cleopatra, which had begun as diplomatic cooperation, swiftly became an intimate personal union. They spent long days together, first in Alexandria, then traveling up the Nile in a journey that entered history as one of the most unusual episodes in the biography of the Roman dictator. The expedition along the Nile's banks had several aims at once. On the one hand, Caesar wanted to see with his own eyes the country that supplied grain to a significant part of the Roman world, a land known in Rome mostly from the reports of merchants, diplomats, and geographers. On the other hand, Cleopatra used the voyage to demonstrate to her people the restoration of lawful rule, to show that Egypt was again under the control of a strong sovereign supported by the most powerful state of the Mediterranean. A flotilla of dozens of ships moved along the Nile, stopping at key religious and administrative centers: Memphis, Hermopolis, and Thebes. At each stop, there were solemn ceremonies, sacrifices to the gods, festivals for the people, and generous offerings to the temples. Caesar visited Egyptian sanctuaries with keen interest, examined their architecture, listened to the priests' stories, and asked about the ancient history of the land and its religious rites. It was at this time that Cleopatra became pregnant. In the spring of the 47th year before Christ, she gave birth to a son. The boy was named Ptolemy XV, but from birth he received the informal name Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Although Caesar never officially recognized him in a strict legal sense, neither did he deny his paternity, and the very fact of the child's birth was perceived as an obvious symbol of the union between Egypt and Rome. After her son's birth, Cleopatra focused on restoring and strengthening Egypt. She revised the tax system, destabilized by years of unrest, improved the organization of grain collection, and launched large-scale works to repair canals and irrigation networks. She paid special attention to reviving the temples, maintaining the authority of the priesthood, and restoring the confidence of provincial elites. The emphasis was on demonstrating that, with the return of lawful rule, order, stability, and prosperity had arrived. Yet Cleopatra understood perfectly that all her internal efforts would be meaningless without a secure position in relations with Rome. And so, in the 46th year before Christ, she resolved to travel to Rome itself, to solidify political agreements with Caesar and to seek recognition of her power and of her son's status. The journey was organized with the greatest possible splendor. Cleopatra arrived in Rome with a vast retinue that included not only her closest advisors, but also representatives of Egyptian temples, officials, guards, musicians, and the attendants of the infant Caesarion. Upon arrival, she took up residence in a luxurious villa that Caesar had arranged for her outside the sacred boundary of the city, on the right bank of the Tiber near the Campus Martius. This allowed her to avoid legal complications. Under Roman custom, foreign monarchs were not permitted within the Pomerium, the city's sacred limits. Cleopatra's presence in Rome became an event of colossal resonance. The Roman aristocracy looked upon the Egyptian queen with suspicion, envy, and irritation. Rumors that Caesar intended not only to recognize Caesarion as his heir, but even to transfer the center of power from Rome to Alexandria spread through the city with alarming speed, although there were no firm facts to support such claims. Particular outrage stemmed from the fact that Caesar already had a lawful wife, Calpurnia. Open relations with Cleopatra were thus perceived as a direct challenge to Roman morals. The situation grew even more provocative when Caesar, without concealing his feelings, ordered a gilded statue of Cleopatra in the guise of Isis to be set up in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, the patroness of the Julian clan. For many Romans, this was not merely eccentricity, but a transgression beyond the bounds of tradition. Despite the gossip and slander, Caesar pressed on according to his interests. He was absorbed in a vast reform of the state, redistributing land, granting citizenship to provincials, founding new colonies, and reorganizing the Senate, curtailing its former powers. He sought to consolidate his authority while formally preserving republican institutions, in effect turning Rome into a personal autocracy. During this time, Cleopatra watched events with utmost attentiveness and caution. She met with influential senators, diplomats, and businessmen, negotiated trade arrangements, and tried not to interfere directly in Roman affairs while quietly building a web of connections that could protect her interests and those of Egypt. She understood that however strong her position appeared, it depended entirely upon Caesar. Any change in his fate would immediately imperil her own standing and her son's future. Still, she continued to fortify her position, believing that her presence in Rome was necessary to legitimize her rule, to affirm Caesarion, and to transform Egypt into a stable, reliable state, existing in the closest alliance with Rome. These months in Rome were for Cleopatra a time of triumph and of hidden tension. She saw conspiracies multiplying around Caesar. Among senators and the old aristocracy, fear of his growing power and of his reforms was rising, as was alarm at the presence in Rome of a powerful Eastern queen. For many, a symbol not merely of foreign influence but of a threat to the foundations of the republican order itself. And yet, despite the latent hostility, despite rumors and intrigue, Cleopatra continued to live in Rome, to make plans, to hope that her alliance with Caesar would prove not a passing episode, but a foundation for a new system of power in which her son would hold an honored place. But fate had prepared a very different turn. On the 15th of March, in the 44th year before Christ, Rome shuddered at an event that changed not only its own destiny, but Cleopatra's as well. That morning, Gaius Julius Caesar went to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate had convened. Despite warnings from friends, ominous portents, and the urgent pleas of his wife Calpurnia to stay at home, Caesar ignored the danger and appeared at the session, believing that his status as dictator and triumphant commander placed him beyond the reach of conspirators. Inside the Curia, the plotters were already waiting, members of Rome's greatest families, among them Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, Decimus Brutus, and others who only yesterday had called themselves his friends. They surrounded Caesar and at a prearranged signal struck him with daggers 23 times. His body fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, the very man he had once defeated in civil war. The scene became a symbol of the end of one world and the beginning of another, far more perilous and chaotic. When news of Caesar's murder reached Cleopatra, she was in her villa beyond the Pomerium on the right bank of the Tiber. Her reaction was immediate. Her alliance with Caesar, both political and personal, collapsed in an instant. With it fell the structure she had built over years, and, most crucially, the fate of her son Caesarion, born of Caesar and destined to be her successor, was thrown into jeopardy. Cleopatra understood that remaining in Rome was mortally dangerous. The city plunged into chaos. Crowds swung between fear and fury. Senators did not know whether they could hold power. Rumors spread through the streets of impending reprisals against all who had been close to the slain dictator. In such circumstances, there was only one course: to leave Rome at once and return to Egypt to save herself, her son, and her control of the state. At her command, preparations for departure began immediately. With her son, a large retinue, senior officials, and priests, she left Rome. The journey home was tense. and filled with foreboding. She could not be sure that power in Rome would not change so radically as to trigger direct intervention in Egypt's affairs. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faced a new political reality. In Rome, the struggle for power raged. The Senate's attempt to restore the old republican order collapsed almost at once. The people rejected Caesar's assassins. Cries for vengeance echoed in the streets. The old order crumbled. Three figures quickly came to the fore. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest associate and one of the most experienced commanders of his time. Octavian, Caesar's adoptive son and heir, only 19 years old but already showing remarkable political instinct. And Marcus Lepidus, commander of the Western armies, influential, though not particularly independent. Knowing that Egypt could not remain apart from these events, Cleopatra immediately moved to strengthen her internal position. Formerly, her younger brother Ptolemy XIV was still co-ruler, but in the 44th year before Christ he died suddenly. Modern historians have little doubt that his death was no accident. Cleopatra removed him to clear the path for her son Caesarion, who now officially took the title Ptolemy XV and was proclaimed her co-ruler. Meanwhile, Rome's power struggle burst into the open. In the 43rd year before Christ, the second triumvirate was formed, a union of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. This alliance was formally constituted, ratified, and granted near-limitless authority. The triumvirs could enact laws without the Senate's consent, execute without trial, confiscate property, raise armies, and appoint governors. A wave of proscription swept Rome, blood-soaked lists condemning political enemies. Within this new order, control over the East passed to Mark Antony. He became the man who held in his hands the fate of all the eastern provinces of the Roman world, Egypt included. Antony was in the city of Tarsus, conducting military and administrative councils, organizing tax levies, and demanding accounts from client kingdoms. Cleopatra received a summons to appear in Tarsus immediately to explain why Egypt, a formal ally of Rome, had failed to provide adequate support in the war against Caesar's murderers. The summons, couched in diplomatic language as a test of loyalty, in reality challenged her to a political duel. Cleopatra had to demonstrate not only her fidelity to the new Roman order, but also her personal authority and her ability to negotiate and defend Egypt's interests. Her answer was swift and extraordinarily theatrical. Instead of arriving in modest state like other client rulers, she staged an entrance that passed into the annals of history. At the mouth of the Cydnus River, her flotilla appeared in full splendor. Ships with purple sails and gilded oars advanced to the sound of music, and the central vessel, canopied with gold and precious fabrics, bore the queen herself, dressed to embody the goddess Isis. Antony, famed for his love of spectacle, pleasure, and grand gestures, was stunned. Their first meeting did not take place in official halls, but aboard Cleopatra's ship, where a lavish banquet was laid out, rare wines, exquisite dishes, music, and performances. That night began not merely negotiations, but an alliance that would soon alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Yet behind the pageantry lay a precise political strategy. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's position was perilous. Rome was too strong to resist and too hungry to ignore the riches of the Nile. Her task was not only to survive, but to secure from Antony a pact that would guarantee Egypt's safety and strengthen her own authority and Caesarion's standing as heir. Antony, for his part, had his own reasons for an alliance. His campaigns demanded immense resources: money, grain, ships, and gold. The eastern provinces, Egypt among them, were the source of all he needed to continue the struggle for power. Moreover, Cleopatra impressed him not only with magnificence, but with her skill in negotiation and her deep knowledge of politics, diplomacy, and culture. After several weeks together in Tarsus, Antony left the administration of the East to his deputies and went with Cleopatra to Alexandria. From that moment, their alliance could no longer be considered purely political. It became personal, tightly interwoven with their ambitions, plans, and destinies. In Alexandria, the life of Antony and Cleopatra took the form of alternating festivals, hunts, theatrical performances, and sumptuous feasts for themselves and the court. Yet behind this outward luxury lay unremitting labor. Ties were strengthened, agreements concluded, and preparations made for the steps that would soon change the political map of the entire Mediterranean. After Mark Antony left Tarsus with Cleopatra and arrived in Alexandria, their alliance rapidly evolved from a political partnership into a full personal and dynastic union, that for several years determined the fate of a vast swath of the eastern Mediterranean. Their relationship went far beyond diplomatic calculation, and Alexandria became not only the capital of Egypt, but the political center of the East, from which decisions radiated outward to touch dozens of peoples and states. At once, there began a new period, marked by a succession of lavish festivities, theatrical spectacles, masquerades, and endless banquets held under the auspices of the so-called Association of the Inimitable Livers. This circle, created at Cleopatra's initiative, included Antony, her closest advisors, favored officers, courtiers, and intellectuals. Each day, its members competed in generosity, wit, and inventiveness. Luxury and extravagance were not mere entertainment, but a staged demonstration of the monarchy's power and boundless resources. Behind the display, however, stood entirely pragmatic aims. Antony needed the East's resources for an inevitable confrontation with Octavian, who was already consolidating power in Rome. Egypt provided Antony not only with gold, grain, and ships, but with a secure base beyond the immediate reach of his Roman rivals. The pivotal political step was a solemn ceremony in Alexandria, at which Antony and Cleopatra publicly proclaimed a division of spheres of influence. Antony assumed the title King of Kings, and Cleopatra Queen of Kings. This ceremony, later interpreted by Roman writers as a form of marriage, though it had no force in Roman law, was in fact more than the affirmation of their personal union. It was a declaration of a new political model, an Eastern monarchy set in deliberate opposition to Rome's center of power. At the same ceremony, Antony conferred titles and nominal realms upon their children. Their son, Alexander Helios, received the title of King of Armenia, Media, and the Parthian territories that Antony intended yet to conquer. The twins, Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, were born in the 40th year before Christ, and some years later a third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born. To him were nominally assigned Phoenicia, Syria, and part of Arabia. Of course, the real frontiers of these realms were largely symbolic, but the political message was unmistakable. Antony and Cleopatra were building an alternative Eastern empire that could rival Octavian's authority. The culmination of this demonstrative redistribution of power was the ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. In the presence of tens of thousands of citizens and nobles, Antony and Cleopatra, seated on gilded thrones, announced the new titles, lands, and rights of their children. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, not only of Egypt but also of Cyprus, Libya, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor, and each child received a share of this symbolic legacy. In Alexandria, the public greeted these decisions with jubilation. The Egyptian priesthood supported the new model, which revived the tradition of pharaonic monarchy, wherein the ruler was regarded as the earthly embodiment of divine order. In Rome, however, the developments provoked a storm of indignation and dread. Octavian's propaganda machine immediately began a campaign to vilify Antony and Cleopatra. The Senate and people were taught to believe that Antony had forfeited the honor of a Roman citizen, become a slave to an Eastern queen, and intended to move the center of power from Rome to Alexandria. Particularly devastating was the furor over a purported will of Antony, which, according to Octavian's claims, granted portions of Roman territory to his children by Cleopatra, and expressed a desire to be buried in Alexandria at Cleopatra's side. Whether the document was authentic remains debated to this day, but whatever the truth, its publication proved a brilliant weapon of political warfare. The Roman public took the revelations as treachery. The Senate finally withdrew its confidence, stripped Antony of his remaining authority, and declared him an enemy of the state. Meanwhile, Octavian continued to consolidate methodically. His control over Italy, Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the western Mediterranean provinces was absolute. He enjoyed the backing of the Senate, of seasoned military legates, and of the vast majority of Rome's populace, which responded readily to his powerful propaganda. Understanding that war was unavoidable, Antony and Cleopatra began a massive mobilization. In Egypt and the territories under their influence, censuses were conducted, tax revenues assessed, and stocks of provisions, weapons, and raw materials reviewed. The fleet was expanded. New ships, mercenaries, war machines, and siege equipment were procured. Soldiers were brought to Alexandria from Syria, Judea, Cilicia, Armenia, and from Arab tribes. Supply agreements were concluded with eastern states. Yet despite a numerical advantage in ships, the resources of Antony and Cleopatra had already begun to fall behind Octavian's. His army was more disciplined, better equipped, and commanded by experienced officers. His fleet was more cohesive and compact. a decisive edge in the kind of naval battle that loomed ahead. Diplomatic contacts between Antony and the Roman Senate ceased entirely. The last attempt at negotiation collapsed. The Senate not only refused to recognize the legitimacy of any decision by Antony, it formally declared war on Cleopatra as Queen of Egypt, deliberately phrasing the decree so as to brand the enemy not as a Roman citizen, Antony, but as a foreign monarchy menacing Rome. By the beginning of the 32nd year before Christ, both sides were racing toward the inevitable war, fully aware that the outcome would determine not only the personal fate of Antony and Cleopatra, but the destiny of the entire Mediterranean world. By the summer of the 31st year before Christ, the confrontation between East and West, between Mark Antony and Cleopatra on the one side and Octavian on the other, had entered its decisive phase, leaving no room for diplomatic maneuvers or hope of compromise. Both sides understood that only war lay ahead, a war that would determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. The main forces of Antony and Cleopatra concentrated at the strategically important port of Actium, situated at the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece. There, an immense camp was established, with fortifications, trenches, defensive towers, and supply systems that, however, grew less reliable with each passing day. Their principal strength was the fleet, more than 200 heavy ships, many of them multi-decked behemoths with powerful rams sheathed in metal plates, towers for archers, and siege engines mounted on their decks. Cleopatra's fleet formed a separate component of this force. The Egyptian squadron lay to the rear, closer to the outlet into the open sea. These ships were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than Antony's vessels, better suited not so much for direct combat as for carrying orders, scouting, and, if necessary, rapid withdrawal. Octavian entrusted command of his fleet to his chief strategist and friend, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a man of exceptional talent in naval operations. Octavian's ships were smaller, but far more agile. Their advantage lay not in head-on collisions, but in the ability to outflank, blockade, disperse, and exhaust the enemy. Agrippa's first moves proved decisive. He quickly seized key coastal towns along Greece's western shore, cut the supply routes of Antony's army, and took control of the sea lanes. This meant that provisions and reinforcements no longer reached Antony's camp, and the position of his army worsened day by day. Hunger, disease, and desertion began to sap their strength as effectively as any battle. Tension mounted inside Antony's camp. Some commanders demanded a swift march inland to force a general engagement on land, where Antony's experienced legions might compensate for the fleet's difficulties. Cleopatra, relying on the calculations of her admirals, insisted on breaking the naval blockade and withdrawing to Egypt, where resources remained to continue the war and rebuild strength. Sources agree that councils in Antony's headquarters grew ever more painful and contentious. Discontent spread through the camp. Rumors of treachery multiplied. Defectors went daily to Octavian, carrying news of the fleet's condition, the plans of the command, and the state within the camp. The battle began on the morning of the 2nd of September in the 31st year before Christ. The weather favored Octavian's lighter craft. A steady sea breeze and a gentle current worked to their advantage. Antony formed his fleet in a crescent at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, hoping to bar the entrance and force Octavian into a frontal attack where the massive rams of his ships could prove superior. But Agrippa refused a frontal assault. He opened with flanking maneuvers, seeking to slice apart the line of Antony's heavy vessels and isolate them from one another. The chief weapons of Octavian's fleet, grappling hooks, boarding bridges, and light catapults, allowed his men to seize and pin down the enemy's hulks, which, because of their size, were unwieldy and slow to respond to rapid changes in the fight. The battle quickly dissolved into a chain of scattered clashes. Octavian's nimble ships swung in on the sides, surrounded isolated heavy vessels of Antony, loosed volleys of arrows and incendiaries, and then took the decks by boarding. At a certain moment, seeing the fight turning into a prolonged war of attrition in which his ships were steadily losing combat effectiveness, Antony prepared for a prearranged maneuver of withdrawal. When Cleopatra raised signal sails on her flagship, her squadron wheeled together and made for the open sea. Whether this was part of the initial plan or a moment of panic remains debated by ancient authors. What is certain is that, on seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, Antony abandoned command of the fleet, left the battle aboard a swift vessel, and followed her, leaving the rest of the fleet and the land army to their fate. After their flight, the battle was effectively lost. The ships that still held formation began to surrender in confusion. Some tried to break south but were destroyed or captured. Others were trapped in a ring and gradually annihilated. Antony's infantry, remaining in the fortified shore camp, at first attempted to organize resistance, but on learning of their commander's flight and the loss of the fleet, they began to pass over en masse to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra sailed first south to the shores of the Peloponnese, then along the coast of Cyprus, avoiding Roman patrols, and after several weeks, reached Alexandria. There they were met by a grim and heavy silence. News of the disaster at Actium had arrived before them, and the whole city already knew that Rome was celebrating victory. In Alexandria, the last attempts were made to salvage the situation. Cleopatra sent a delegation to Octavian offering peace. She was prepared to renounce Antony, surrender Egypt's entire treasury, and recognize Rome's supremacy if she might keep her crown and independence for her children. Antony, on hearing this, raged, yet, as events soon showed, he himself within days began offering Octavian his surrender and a request to withdraw into private exile. Octavian rejected every proposal. For him, there was no path but the complete destruction of the power of Antony and Cleopatra. Egypt must become part of the Roman state, and the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty must end with the life of its last queen. The end was now inevitable. When Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after the catastrophic defeat at Actium, they no longer entertained illusions that the situation could be saved by military means. Egypt stood utterly alone before the inexorable Roman machine. The fleet was destroyed, the army demoralized, allies scattered or defected to Octavian, and Rome was celebrating victory and preparing to place the final period in the long struggle for power. From the autumn of the 31st year before Christ, Octavian began a methodical preparation for the final invasion of Egypt. His army, significantly reinforced by ships and legions gathered from the eastern provinces, advanced slowly but surely to the south, securing key coastal cities, intercepting trade routes, and severing what remained of Egypt's diplomatic ties to the outside world. Along the way, he concluded agreements with the rulers of Judea, Syria, and Cilicia, ensuring a reliable rear and uninterrupted supplies for his army. Cleopatra continued to search desperately for a way out. Negotiations with Octavian proceeded through various envoys and intermediaries, but her proposals came to the same point: to hand over to Rome the entire fleet, the treasury, and Egypt's garrisons in exchange for the preservation of her throne and safety for her children. Octavian, feigning willingness to talk, skillfully drew out time, understanding that every delay only strengthened his position and weakened morale and military resistance in Alexandria. Meanwhile, Antony sank into despair. Having lost his army and been stripped of fleet and support, he withdrew more and more from affairs, avoided public appearances, and spent time in his own chambers, alternating dark brooding with feasts that grew by the day more desperate and joyless. In the spring of the 30th year before Christ, Octavian's forces crossed Egypt's borders. Garrisons left to guard roads and strategic points either surrendered without a fight or offered almost no resistance. By July, the army had reached the walls of Alexandria. Skirmishes and local fights flared on the city's approaches, but no one doubted this was the death throes. Only the timing remained in question. In these days occurred the episode that remains one of the most famous and tragic scenes of ancient history. Antony received word that Cleopatra had taken her own life. Sources differ on how this report arose. By one version, the false news was spread by Cleopatra's intimates to push Antony toward decisive action. By another, Cleopatra herself, no longer hoping for a joint escape, deliberately set this deception in motion, calculating that news of her death, or even the rumor of it, would drive Antony to kill himself, thus allowing her to negotiate with Octavian by offering a surrender without resistance. However it was, upon hearing of her supposed death, Antony made the decision that had long ripened within him. He ordered his slave Eros to kill him. Eros, unable to do so, killed himself. Then Antony, mustering his last strength, drove his sword into his own abdomen. The wound was not immediately mortal. He lost consciousness from loss of blood, but he lived. At that moment, someone among the servants told him Cleopatra was alive, shut within her apartments in one of the palace towers. Half alive, Antony was carried there, according to tradition, hoisted through a window since the palace entrances were already held by Roman soldiers. Their final meeting took place in the presence of the few remaining attendants. Bleeding, Antony managed a few words, begging her not to trust Octavian, to preserve the lives of the children, and if possible, to save her own. He died in her arms. After his death, Cleopatra negotiated with Octavian for several more days, hoping to persuade him to spare her life and crown, or at least to guarantee safety for the children. Octavian, as before, behaved outwardly with courtesy and restraint, promising to consider her requests while constantly advancing new conditions, demanding the treasury, the surrender of garrisons, and her personal capitulation. Reports began to reach Cleopatra that Octavian had no intention of treating with her as an equal, that she faced not a peace treaty, but the humiliation of being paraded in a Roman triumph, chained in gold before the crowd as a victor's trophy. Then she understood that the only way to preserve her dignity was death. On the 29th of August in the 30th year before Christ, while under guard in her own apartments, Cleopatra ordered that a basket of figs be brought. By one account, a venomous cobra, the uraeus, symbol of Egyptian royalty, was concealed within it. By another, it was a potent poison hidden in a hairpin or in a vial of ointment. Her servants obeyed. She lay upon her couch, robed in royal garments, and took the poison. Her attendants, Eris and Charmian, stayed with her to the end. According to tradition, when Roman soldiers forced the doors, they found Cleopatra dead, and her attendants, still alive, but dying, straightened her clothing and hair so that even death would not undo her dignity. Octavian, arriving shortly thereafter, ordered that Cleopatra be buried beside Mark Antony, fulfilling her last wish. Perhaps the gesture was dictated less by mercy than by a desire to demonstrate to the Roman people his power over the fates of kings and queens. Immediately afterward, Octavian declared Egypt his personal possession, not merely a province, but a territory administered directly by the emperor and his prefects. All the wealth of Egypt, gold, grain, papyrus, the products of craftsmen, and the revenues of the ports, henceforth flowed directly into the imperial treasury. Thus ended the story of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, since Ptolemy Lagus, one of Alexander the Great's closest companions, founded it after the division of the empire. With its end came the close of the Hellenistic Age, the time when East and West could still exist as equal civilizations. From that moment, the entire Mediterranean fell under the authority of a single center, Rome. When the walls of Alexandria fell silent, when the last Ptolemy was no more, and the banners of Rome's eagles were raised over Egypt, a new period began, a time when the story of Cleopatra ceased to be merely the biography of a queen and became a legend that would live for centuries, changing form, meaning, and image. After her death, the fate of her children was among the first matters Octavian addressed. Caesarion, Ptolemy XV, the son of Cleopatra, and in all likelihood Julius Caesar, was immediately declared a threat to the new order. It was too dangerous to leave alive a youth who by birth could claim not only Egypt's throne, but by the logic of ancient politics, even Rome's, were he to rally supporters hostile to Octavian. By Octavian's order, Caesarion was seized while attempting to flee south into Nubia and executed. He was only 17 years old. Cleopatra's children by Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken alive and sent to Rome. There they appeared in Octavian's triumphal procession, dressed in Eastern garments and bound with golden chains, symbolizing not their guilt, but the defeat of their parents and of the East itself. After the triumph, Octavian did not put them to death. They were too young and posed no immediate danger. The children were placed under the protection of Octavia, Octavian's sister, and at the same time, Mark Antony's former wife. Octavia raised them as her own, securing for them an honorable place in Roman society. Of all Cleopatra and Antony's children, only Cleopatra Selene reached full adulthood. She married Juba II, king of Mauritania, a ruler educated at the Roman court, learned and loyal to Rome. Together they governed Mauritania, making it one of the most prosperous and Hellenized client kingdoms of the Roman world. Their descendants continued to rule parts of North Africa for several generations, leaving their mark as Roman clients, semi-autonomous yet formally dependent monarchs. The story of Cleopatra herself soon began to turn into myth. Already in the Roman era, 2 parallel narratives formed around her image. The first, official, crafted by the victors and by Octavian's propaganda, portrayed Cleopatra as a seductress whose charms clouded Antony's mind, as the embodiment of a dangerous East that threatened Rome's stern morals and order. The second, less official but no less influential, preserved Cleopatra as a woman of extraordinary intellect, political talent, education, and the capacity to contend as an equal with the most powerful men of her age. Over the centuries, the mythology only deepened. Ancient authors, Plutarch, Dio Cassius, Appian, described her appearance, character, and habits in differing ways. Some claimed her beauty was dazzling. Others wrote that her allure lay less in features than in mind, voice, refined manners, subtle humor, and the to enchant any interlocutor regardless of rank or intent. Medieval Europe nearly forgot Cleopatra, but with the Renaissance her image returned, first in Latin chronicles, then in the works of painters and playwrights. Her story inspired William Shakespeare, who wrote the tragedy Antony and Cleopatra, where the lover's personal drama is interwoven with the fall of kingdoms and the turning of an age. In the 17th and 18th centuries, she became the heroine of dozens of operas, paintings, and literary works, where her figure was finally transformed into a symbol of feminine power, passion, beauty, and fatal danger. In the 19th century, amid a vogue for the Orient and for Egyptology, her name again surged through artistic culture. Cleopatra appears on the canvases of Jean-Léon Gérôme and Lawrence Alma Tadema, in sculpture and architecture, and in historical novels and theatrical productions, at times as an exotic queen amid gold and marble, at times as a tragic woman crushed by merciless history. In the 20th century, her image fully entered mass culture. Films, including the famous Hollywood epic starring Elizabeth Taylor, made her a worldwide symbol, a sovereign queen, a femme fatale, a politician, a lover, a myth, a legend. Historians, however, continued to search out the real Cleopatra behind those artistic layers, sifting documents, coins, inscriptions, and literary sources to reconstruct the woman behind the masks. Today, Cleopatra's name remains among the most recognizable on the planet. It has become a synonym not only for power, but for the capacity to withstand circumstance, to play as an equal in a world whose rules were written by men. Her story is not merely the tale of the fall of Egypt's last queen, it is the chronicle of the end of an entire era, when East and West could still regard one another with equal dignity. Thus ended the life of Egypt's last queen, and began her eternity in history.